The town of redemption baked under a sun that offered no mercy, bleaching the dust-choked street to the color of bone. Gideon Holt felt the heat press down on him like a physical weight, a familiar oppression he usually escaped in the cool, thin air of the high ridges. He rarely came down from the mountains, preferring the company of pines and silence to the clamor of men. But his flour sack was empty, and his salt was gone, and survival demanded this pilgrimage into the world he had abandoned. He stood outside the general store, the smells of leather coffee and civilization thick in his nose. Children chased a stray dog down the street, their laughter sharp and bright. A blacksmith's hammer rang a steady rhythm against an anvil. For a moment, a phantom ache bloomed in Gideon's chest, a memory of another life, another town, another sun, whose laughter had once filled his world. He pushed it down, a practiced motion of the heart, and turned his steps toward the Redemption Bank. The building stood proud on the corner, its brick facade a testament to the town's burgeoning hope. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of paper and coin. He nodded curtly to the teller, a young man with a face yet unlined by hardship, and made his way to the small secure room in the back. From his deposit box, he withdrew a small sum for his supplies, and then paused, his calloused fingers brushing against the velvet pouch that held his only true possession. He didn't need to look at it. The image was burned behind his eyes, a silver locket tarnished with age, containing 2 miniature hand-painted portraits. One was of his wife Sarah, her smile as gentle as a summer dawn. The other was of his son Thomas, his eyes bright with a future he would never see. It was the last piece of them he had, a tangible anchor to a past that was both his greatest treasure and his heaviest cross. He closed the box, the locket safely inside, and returned to the main lobby, his business concluded. He was halfway to the door when chaos erupted. The batwing doors of the bank slammed open, crashing against the walls. 3 men stormed in bandanas, pulled high over their faces, their movements too fluid, too precise for common thugs. They moved like a unit, a pack of wolves descending on a fold. One man leveled a shotgun at the cowering customers, his voice a low growl. On the floor, now. Gideon's hand instinctively went to the Colt peacemaker holstered at his hip, but he froze. There were a dozen people in the bank. Women, a few children, the young teller whose face had gone white with terror. A single shot would turn this robbery into a bloodbath. He sank to the floor with the others, his body coiled like a spring, his eyes missing nothing. The leader strode past them, his boots echoing on the marble floor. He was taller than the others, his movements graceful, almost elegant. He didn't bark orders. His voice was calm, cultured, a chilling counterpoint to the violence he commanded. "The vault, if you please," he said to the teller, gesturing with the barrel of a silver-inlaid revolver. As 2 of the men emptied the cash drawers, the leader, Silas Croft, though Gideon did not yet know his name, followed the trembling teller to the vault. Gideon watched, his mind racing. This was too organized. They weren't just grabbing money and running. There was a purpose here, a cold and deliberate intelligence that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. Silas emerged from the vault, not with bags of gold, but with a small collection of safety deposit boxes which he dumped unceremoniously onto a table. He ignored the ones filled with jewelry and deeds, his gloved hands searching for something specific. He found it, Gideon's box. With a small crowbar, he pried it open. Gideon's blood ran cold. Silas reached inside and pulled out the velvet pouch. He opened it, and the silver locket fell into his palm. He clicked it open, his gaze lingering on the tiny portraits within. A strange, unreadable expression crossed his face. Not greed, but something far more complex, something akin to satisfaction to the closing of a circle. He slipped the locket into his coat pocket. "We have what we came for," Silas announced, his voice carrying across the silent room. "Let's not be greedy." Rage pure and white-hot surged through Gideon. That locket was not money. It was Sarah's last gift. It was Thomas's smile frozen in time. It was the sacred heart of his grief, and this man had stolen it, with the casual indifference of a crow stealing a piece of tin. Gideon's muscles tensed. He could draw his Colt in a heartbeat, put a bullet through the man's skull before he took another breath. But the shotgun was still aimed at a mother clutching her child, and the cost of his vengeance would be their lives. His hand remained still, his knuckles white. He was trapped a mountain lion in a cage of his own making. The robbers backed out of the bank, their guns never wavering. "A pleasure doing business with you," Silas said with a theatrical bow, his eyes cold and dark above his bandana, sweeping over the prone figures on the floor. For a fleeting second, his gaze seemed to lock with Gideon's, a spark of recognition, or perhaps a silent promise of future torment passing between them. Then they were gone, the thunder of their horses' hooves fading down the street. For a long moment the bank was utterly still, the silence broken only by a woman's soft weeping. Gideon rose slowly, his body aching with a fury he could not unleash. He walked to the empty deposit box, his hand tracing the splintered wood where his past had been ripped away. The money was gone, but that was dust. The locket. The locket was his soul. The sheriff and his deputies burst in moments later shouting questions. But Gideon didn't hear them. He walked out into the blinding sun, his mind a maelstrom. This was no random act. The leader had known exactly which box to open. He had come for the locket. He had come for him. Why, the question burned in his gut, a fire stoked with the fuel of a long-buried past. He bought his flour and salt with the few coins in his pocket, and left redemption without another word, his mule trailing behind him as he climbed back toward the silent peaks. But the silence offered no comfort now. The mountains, once his sanctuary, felt like a prison. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was filled with the echo of a calm, cruel voice and the phantom weight of a stolen locket. The world he had run from had found him, and it had taken the last thing he had left to lose. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The thief hadn't just stolen a piece of silver. He had lit a fuse that stretched back a decade, a fuse that would lead to a reckoning written in blood and fire. High in the stony embrace of the granite peaks, Gideon's cabin stood as a monument to his exile. Hewn from the pines that surrounded it, it was more a fortress against memory than a home. For 10 years he had lived there alone, the silence broken only by the wind's mournful song through the timber. He had sought this solitude, craved it, for it was the only penance he could imagine for the life he had taken. The memory was always there, lurking in the shadows of the firelight, a ghost that never slept. It was a saloon in a town, long since vanished from his path, the air thick with whiskey and sweat. A card game, a foolish accusation, a drunken shove. Jacob Croft, a man with more pride than sense, had drawn on him. Gideon, faster and younger, had drawn back. He'd aimed for the man's arm, a shot to disarm, to end the stupidity. But a bystander stumbled, bumping his elbow at the precise moment he fired. The bullet went wide, striking Croft square in the chest. Gideon could still see the shock on Jacob's face, the life draining from his eyes. He could still hear the scream from the corner of the room, a younger man, barely more than a boy, his face a mask of horror and rage. Jacob's brother. Silas. The law had called it self-defense, a tragic accident. But Gideon called it a failing. His skill with a gun, once a point of pride, had become a curse. He had buried his wife and son months earlier, taken by fever, and in that moment, seeing the life ebb from Jacob Croft, he felt he had become death itself. He'd hung up his gun belt that day, vowing never again to take a man's life, and fled to the mountains to serve his self-imposed sentence. Now, sitting by his cold hearth, the bank robbery replayed in his mind. The leader's calm demeanor, his precise actions, the way his eyes had seemed to find him on the floor. It couldn't be a coincidence. But how could Silas Croft, the boy who had watched his brother die, have known about the locket? How could he have orchestrated such a flawless raid? Not for money, but for a piece of Gideon's soul. The questions were a swarm of hornets in his head, stinging him with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. His exile had been a lie. He had not escaped his past. It had been hunting him all along. A week passed, and then two. The snows began to fall, blanketing the high country in a shroud of white. Gideon tried to settle back into his routine, checking his traps, chopping wood, staring into the fire. But the peace was gone. The silence was a void where the memory of Sarah's smile used to be. The theft of the locket had reopened a wound he'd thought long scarred over, and it was bleeding him dry from the inside out. It was during a hunt miles from his cabin that the world shifted on its axis once more. He was tracking a buck along a frozen creek bed near a string of abandoned mining shacks, remnants of a failed gold rush. The air was still the snow unmarked, save for the tracks of deer and fox. Then he heard it, a sound so alien in this wilderness that it stopped him dead. The faint, rhythmic clinking of iron. His hunter's instincts took over. He moved silently, his rifle held low, weaving through the skeletal remains of the shacks. The sound grew louder, accompanied by something else, a soft, desperate weeping. He rounded the corner of a dilapidated ore processing shed and froze. There, chained to a heavy support beam, was a child. A little girl no older than 7, her dress a collection of rags, her face smudged with dirt and tears. Her wrists were raw, where the iron cuffs bit into her skin, and a heavy chain snaked from them to a bolt driven deep into the wood. She was shivering not just from the cold, but from a terror so profound it seemed to have hollowed her out. She looked up as his shadow fell over her, her eyes a startling blue, widening with a mixture of fear and a desperate, impossible hope. Her voice was a dry, rasping whisper, as if reciting a sacred text. "Mama said you'd come," she breathed. Gideon stared, his mind struggling to comprehend the sight. A chained child in the middle of nowhere. It was a vision from a nightmare. He took a slow step forward, his boots crunching in the snow. The girl flinched, but held his gaze. "Mama said the mountain man would save me." She repeated, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "She said you weren't a killer, not really. She said you had a good heart under all that stone." The words struck Gideon with the force of a physical blow. Mountain man. The name the townspeople sometimes used for him, a half-mythical figure who lived in the peaks. But her mother? Who was her mother? How could she have known of him, let alone spoken of him with such faith? He knelt, his gaze falling to the cruel iron, biting into her flesh. A storm of rage, cold and pure, washed through him. Whatever darkness had brought this child here, it was a darkness he was sworn to fight. His vow not to kill had been about ending pointless violence, not about turning his back on evil. "What's your name, child?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Clara," she whispered. He reached for the chains. They were thick, the lock heavy and rusted. He didn't have a key. Without a word, he wrapped his powerful hands around the central link. He planted his feet, grit his teeth, and pulled. The muscles in his back and arms screamed in protest. The chain groaned, the iron links straining against each other. Clara watched, her eyes wide, her breath held. With a roar that tore from the depths of his soul, Gideon gave one final, violent heave. Metal shrieked and then snapped. The chain fell away. Clara stumbled forward, her legs giving way, and he caught her, pulling her into his arms. She was feather-light, a bundle of sharp bones and trembling fear. She buried her face in his worn leather coat, her small body racked with sobs of relief. He held her, the unfamiliar weight, both a burden and a blessing. As he cradled her, a glint of metal on the beam caught his eye. Nailed to the wood just above where her head had been was a faded photograph, curled and weathered by the elements. It was a picture of two men's arms slung around each other, smiling. One was Jacob Croft. The other was a younger, harder version of the man who had robbed the redemption bank. A cold dread washed over Gideon. This was no random abandonment. This was a message. This was bait. A sharp snap echoed from the ridge above, the distinct sound of a rifle being cocked. Gideon's head snapped up, his body instinctively shielding Clara. 3 figures stood silhouetted against the gray sky, their rifles leveled. A familiar voice, smooth and laced with venom, drifted down on the wind. "Evening, Holt. I see you found the little lost lamb. Silas wants you alive for now. But the girl belongs to us." The name hit him like a bullet. Silas. The trap had been sprung, and Gideon Holt, the man who had run from his past for a decade, had just walked right into it. The forest became a blur of motion and sound. Gideon scooped Clara into his arms, her small frame pressed tight against his chest, and broke for the trees. A rifle shot cracked the bullet, whining past his ear and splintering the bark of a pine just inches away. Clara flinched, burying her face deeper into his coat, but she made no sound. Her terror was a silent, desperate thing. "Hold on." Gideon grunted, his legs pumping, driving him deeper into the familiar embrace of the timberline. The mountains were his home, every rock and ravine an old friend. These men were trespassers, and he would make them bleed for their intrusion. Behind them, shouts echoed. "He's in the trees, fan out. The boss wants him breathing, but he didn't say he wanted him whole." Gideon moved with a speed born of desperation and an intimate knowledge of the terrain. He didn't run in a straight line. He weaved using the thick trunks of ancient pines for cover his boots, finding purchase on snow-covered game trails invisible to most eyes. He could hear their horses struggling, the men cursing as branches whipped at their faces. They were riders, plainsmen, perhaps, unused to the close, suffocating nature of the high country forest. It was his only advantage. He found a small rock outcropping, a shallow overhang, barely big enough to conceal them, and slid inside, pressing Clara gently into the darkest corner. He pulled his heavy coat around her, a meager shield against the biting cold. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. "Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." Her blue eyes, wide and luminous in the gloom, stared up at him. She gave a tiny, trembling nod. In her hand, she clutched a tattered piece of faded calico, rubbing it with her thumb in a repetitive, soothing motion. A piece of her mother's dress, he realized. Her own version of his locket. Gideon slipped back out, his Winchester now in his hands. The rifle felt like an extension of his arm, a grim and familiar weight. He crept to the edge of the trees, peering down the slope. One of the riders had dismounted and was moving forward on foot, his eyes scanning the snow for tracks. Gideon raised the rifle with the man's chest, filling his sights. His finger tightened on the trigger, but he hesitated. You weren't a killer, not really. Clara's words, her mother's words, echoed in his mind. He lowered his aim. A crack echoed through the forest, and the man screamed, dropping his rifle as he clutched a shattered knee. He hadn't killed him, but he had ended his part in this fight. The other 2 riders opened fire, their bullets ripping through the trees around him. Gideon returned fire, not aiming to kill, but to drive them back to sow chaos. He shot the reins out of one rider's hands, sending the spooked horse bolting into the woods. The second man, seeing his partners disabled, wheeled his horse around and retreated, disappearing back down the trail. The immediate danger had passed, but Gideon knew it was a temporary reprieve. They knew where he was. They would be back, and they would bring more men. He returned to the outcropping and gathered Clara into his arms. She looked at the bloodstains in the snow where the man had fallen, her expression somber. "We have to go," he said gently. "We have to go somewhere safe." The only place he could think of was Abraham Cutter's cabin. It was a 2-day journey across the most unforgiving part of the ridge, but Abraham was the only man in these mountains he would trust with his life, and now with Clara's. Their friendship had been fractured by the tragedy in that saloon. Abraham's stern faith clashing with Gideon's spiraling guilt, but the bond forged in their youth ran deep. If anyone would help, it would be him. The journey was a crucible. A bitter wind swept down from the peaks, driving snow before it. Gideon wrapped Clara in his bedroll, carrying her against his chest to share his body heat. He moved relentlessly, stopping only for brief moments to force scraps of jerky and sips of water from his canteen into her. She was quiet, her resilience a source of silent astonishment for Gideon. She didn't complain. She endured. During one of their brief rests, huddled in the lee of a boulder, as the wind howled around them, she spoke, her voice small against the storm. "Mama told me stories about you." Gideon, checking the action on his rifle, paused. "Stories?" "She said the mountain had a guardian." Clara whispered, her eyes fixed on the swirling snow. "A man who lost his own little boy and carried the hurt like a heavy coat. She said he was the strongest man in the world, not because he could fight, but because he'd learned how to be gentle again." Gideon's throat tightened. He couldn't speak. Who was this woman who had seen so clearly into the broken heart of a man she'd likely never met? She was sick for a long time. Clara continued, her voice trembling. "Before the bad men came. She told me if anything happened to her, I had to run to the mountains and find you. She gave me the scrap from her dress so I wouldn't forget her smell. She said you'd know what to do. She said you'd save me." He finally found his voice, a rough, gravelly thing. "How did she know my name?" Clara shook her head. "She never said your name. She just called you the mountain man, the bad men. They were the ones who knew your name." Gideon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow. Silas had not just been watching him. He had been studying him, learning his habits, his history. He had somehow found Clara and her mother and woven them into his venomous plot. They pressed on. As they traveled, Gideon's mind worked, piecing together the fragments. Silas Croft, Jacob Croft's brother, the stolen locket, Clara used as bait. But why revenge for his brother's death was the obvious answer, but the scale of it felt wrong. The organized gang, the slaver-like operation. It was too large, too elaborate for a simple vendetta. There had to be something more. He began to scout as they traveled, leaving Clara hidden while he surveyed the valleys below. He saw them, Silas's men, spread out in disciplined patrols, their campfires dotting the lowlands like a malevolent constellation. He crept close to one patrol, hiding in the brush as they spoke. "The boss is getting impatient," one grumbled. "All this for one man and a girl." "It's not about the girl, you fool," another sneered. "It's about Holt. It's about a debt. You heard what Silas said, an eye for an eye." The biblical phrase hung in the cold air. Gideon saw Silas himself near the main camp, a solitary figure staring into the flames. He was holding something, turning it over in his hands. Even from a distance, Gideon recognized the dull gleam of silver. The locket. A moment later, Silas looked up from the locket and pulled a faded, dog-eared photograph from his pocket, his expression a mixture of grief and cold fury. The pieces clicked into place with the sickening finality of a cell door slamming shut. He made his way back to where he'd left Clara, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. Jacob Croft wasn't just a name from his past. Gideon remembered something else from that night, a detail long buried under layers of guilt. Jacob had been talking about his family before the fight, boasting about his beautiful wife and his newborn daughter. A daughter named Clara. Silas Croft wasn't just Jacob's brother. He was Clara's uncle. This entire ordeal, the bank robbery, the kidnapping, the hunt, and it was all an act of monstrous, calculated revenge. Silas hadn't just stumbled upon Clara. He had used his own niece, his dead brother's child, as a pawn in his twisted game. He was systematically stripping away everything Gideon had ever cared about, first the symbol of his past, now the hope for a future. Gideon was not being hunted. He was being dissected, his soul laid bare for one man's vengeance. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. He looked at Clara sleeping fitfully in her hiding place, and understood the true depth of the evil they were facing. This was not a fight for survival. It was a war for a child's soul, and he was the only thing standing in the devil's way. The last few miles to Abraham Cutter's cabin were the hardest. The revelation about Silas and Clara had settled deep in Gideon's bones, a cold weight of dread. He was no longer just a protector. He was a key player in a tragedy that had begun a decade ago. He pushed onward Clara, a warm, trusting presence in his arms, his resolve hardening with every step. Abraham's cabin was tucked into a small, sheltered valley, smoke curling from its stone chimney like a prayer. As Gideon approached, the front door creaked open. Abraham stood in the doorway, a double-barreled shotgun held loosely in his hands, his face a mask of wary surprise. His beard was shot through with more gray than Gideon remembered, but his eyes were the same sharp, discerning, missing nothing. Gideon Holt. Abraham said, his voice a low rumble. "I'd say you look like you've seen a ghost, but it appears you've brought one with you." His gaze softened as it fell on the sleeping child in Gideon's arms. "Can we come in, Abraham?" Gideon asked, the exhaustion of the last 2 days finally catching up to him. "There's a storm coming." Abraham stepped aside, his eyes never leaving Gideon's face. "It seems the storm is already here." Inside the cabin was warm and smelled of wood smoke and brewing coffee. Gideon gently laid Clara on a cot by the fire, pulling a thick wool blanket over her. For the first time in days, her small face relaxed in the safety of true sleep. Gideon sat heavily at the rough-hewn table, the stories spilling out of him. From the bank, the locket, finding Clara, the men who knew his name, and his final horrifying realization about Silas Croft being her uncle. Abraham listened in silence, his expression growing grimmer with every word. When Gideon finished, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. "Vengeance is a poison that rots the soul," Abraham said finally, his voice heavy. "This Silas has let it consume him whole if he's willing to use his own blood as bait." He poured 2 cups of coffee, his hands steady. "The Lord tests us, Gideon. He puts the lost lamb in the path of the wounded lion to see if the lion still remembers its strength." "I'm not a lion, Abraham," Gideon said, his voice raw. "I'm the man who started all this. Jacob Croft died because of me." Jacob Croft died because of his own pride and a stray bullet. Abraham countered, his gaze firm. "Tragedy is not the same as sin. You've carried that cross long enough. Now you have a child to think of." A fragile sense of hope began to bloom in Gideon's chest, the first in years. He wasn't alone in this fight. But the hope was short-lived. A sharp thud from outside made both men freeze. It was the sound of a horse stumbling, followed by a muffled curse. Gideon was on his feet in an instant, his Winchester in his hands, moving to the window. Peering through a crack in the shutters, his blood ran cold. The cabin was surrounded. At least a dozen of Silas's men were dismounting in the trees, moving into position with silent, deadly efficiency. They had been tracked. "They're here," Gideon breathed. Abraham grabbed his shotgun, his face grim. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want—" He murmured more a warrior's creed than a prayer. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." But sometimes he asks us to make our stand in the valley of the shadow of death. The first shout came from the trees, Silas's voice amplified by the cold, still air. "Gideon Holt, I know you're in there. You have something that belongs to me. Send out my niece, and I will grant you a swift end. Resist, and I will burn this cabin to the ground with all of you inside." Clara stirred on the cot, whimpering in her sleep. Gideon's heart clenched. Silas had laid his trap, and now he was closing the jaws. "He won't get her." Gideon snarled, his voice a low promise. The siege began. The first volley of shots shattered the cabin's windows, sending glass and splinters flying. Gideon and Abraham returned fire, using the sturdy log walls for cover. The cabin became a fortress, the two men a garrison of two against an army. They fought with the grim efficiency of men who had seen battle before. Their movements synchronized, their shots precise. For an hour they held them back. But Silas's men were relentless. They used the terrain, moving from tree to tree, their fire constant and overwhelming. Gideon knew they couldn't hold out forever. Their ammunition was finite, and Silas's patience was running out. Then the attack shifted. A flaming arrow thudded into the roof, the dry shingles catching fire almost instantly. Smoke began to fill the cabin. "They're trying to smoke us out," Abraham yelled, coughing. Gideon looked at Clara, who was now awake. Her eyes wide with terror, huddled on the floor. He had to get her out. There was a cellar door beneath a rug in the corner, leading to a small root cellar with a narrow escape tunnel that opened into the ravine behind the cabin. It was their only chance. "Get her to the cellar," Gideon shouted to Abraham. "I'll hold them off." Abraham scooped Clara into his arms and disappeared through the trapdoor. Gideon laid down a volley of suppressing fire, his rifle bucking against his shoulder. He could hear the men outside preparing for a final rush. He had to buy Abraham and Clara time. He was ramming another cartridge into his rifle when a figure burst through the shattered front door, not one of the thugs, but Silas himself, moving with a predator's speed. Before Gideon could raise his rifle, Silas fired. The bullet slammed into Gideon's side, a searing, white-hot pain that buckled his knees. He staggered back, his rifle clattering to the floor. Silas stood over him, his face a mask of triumphant hatred, his silver-inlaid revolver aimed at Gideon's head. "It's over, Holt. You took my brother. Now I take everything from you." From outside, a cry of terror pierced the roar of the fire. "Clara!" Gideon twisted his head to see two of Silas's men dragging her from the ravine, Abraham lying unconscious on the ground behind them, a bloody gash on his forehead. Clara screamed his name, fighting against their grip. "Gideon!" Silas smiled, a slow, cruel curving of his lips. "You see, I told you. Everything." He gestured to his men. "Take her. We're leaving." He lowered his pistol from Gideon's head. "I'm not going to kill you, Holt. Not yet. I want you to live with this. I want you to know that you failed. That the child who believed in you is going to a place where hope dies. Live with that. Let it eat you alive." He turned and walked out. leaving Gideon bleeding on the floor of the burning cabin. The last thing Gideon saw before the smoke and pain consumed him was Clara's terrified face as she was dragged away, her small hand reaching for him, her voice screaming his name until it was swallowed by the roar of the flames. The world came back in shards of pain and smoke. Gideon coughed, his lungs filled with soot, the fire in his side a roaring agony. The cabin roof was collapsing, sending a shower of embers down around him. He had to move. Using the wall for support, he dragged himself to his feet, his vision swimming. He stumbled out the back door just as the main roof beam gave way. With a deafening crash, the cabin imploding into a funeral pyre. He found Abraham slumped against a tree, stirring, his hand pressed to the gush on his head. "Gideon, the girl, they have her." Gideon rasped the words like shards of glass in his throat. He tore a strip of cloth from his shirt and pressed it against the bleeding wound in his side, his face pale and grim in the firelight. Silas took her. Abraham struggled to his feet, his face etched with shame and fury. "He can't have gone far. We have to—" "No." Gideon cut him off. "We're in no shape to fight, and he'll be expecting it. He wants me to follow blindly. We do this my way, on my terms." The sky was beginning to bleed with the first light of dawn, and the eastern peaks painted in shades of bruised purple. An unnatural wind was picking up, moaning through the pines, carrying the scent of dust and distant dry earth. A storm was coming, not of rain, but of dust. A dust storm. Abraham set his eyes on the horizon. A bad one. Gideon's gaze followed his. An idea desperate and dangerous began to form in his mind. "It's a gift from God," he said, his voice low and intense. "He's giving us cover." They spent the morning preparing. Gideon, despite the fire in his side, moved with a feverish intensity. He cleaned their rifles, gathered what little ammunition had survived the fire, and packed a small satchel with bandages and water. He found a flask of whiskey in Abraham's saddlebag and took a long swallow of the liquor, a clean fire that momentarily dulled the pain. As they worked, Abraham looked at him, his eyes filled with a heavy guilt. "Gideon, there's something I have to tell you." His voice was strained. "Silas Croft. I knew he was looking for you." Gideon stopped, his hands stilling on the rifle he was cleaning. "What?" "Years ago." Abraham confessed, his gaze dropping to the ground. "A man came through redemption asking questions about the fella who shot Jacob Croft. Said his name was Silas. I heard he was filled with hate. I never told you because I wanted to protect you. I thought if you stayed hidden up here, he'd never find you. I thought my silence was a shield. I never imagined he would do something like this." The confession hung between them, heavy and sharp. For a moment, Gideon felt a flash of betrayal, hot and bitter. But then he looked at his old friend's face, at the genuine anguish in his eyes, and the anger subsided, replaced by a weary understanding. They were both men haunted by the past, who had made choices based on fear and grief. "Your silence didn't cause this, Abraham." Gideon said, his voice quiet but firm. "Silas did. His hate did. We'll end it. Together." The reconciliation was unspoken, but absolute. They were brothers in arms, once more united against a common darkness. By midday, the sky had turned a sickly yellow-orange. The wind howled, whipping dust and grit into the air, reducing visibility to mere feet. The storm had arrived. "It's time," Gideon said. They followed the tracks left by Silas's gang, the trail clear, even in the growing gloom. They moved like ghosts through the swirling red dust, the wind masking the sound of their approach. Silas's camp was nestled in a box canyon, a natural fortress, but the storm was the great equalizer. It blinded his lookouts and sowed confusion among his men. As they crept closer, they heard a train whistle long and mournful, cutting through the wind. "That's the 4:30 to the territories," Abraham whispered. "They're planning on shipping the captives out on that train." The ticking clock spurred them on. They reached the edge of the canyon, peering down into a maelstrom of dust and chaos. Men were struggling to hold down tents, horses were panicked, and visibility was almost zero. Through a brief lull in the storm, Gideon saw them, Clara and a dozen other captives, chained together near a covered wagon ready to be moved. Gideon and Abraham split up, agreeing to attack from opposite sides, using the storm as their ally. Gideon slipped down the canyon wall, the grit stinging his eyes, the pain in his side, a constant throbbing reminder of what was at stake. He reached the canyon floor and moved through the camp like a wraith. A guard loomed out of the dust, and Gideon silenced him with the butt of his rifle before the man could cry out. He reached the wagon where Clara was being held. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. But when she saw him, a flicker of hope ignited in their depths. He was working on the chains when Silas's voice cut through the howl of the wind, chillingly close. "I knew you'd come, Holt. A man can't run from his own damnation." Silas stepped out of the swirling dust, a specter in the red gloom. His face was contorted with a righteous fury. "You took my brother, a good man. You shattered my family, and for what a drunken argument over cards. I've spent 10 years planning this. Every man I've hired, every soul I've chained, it was all to build the resources to find you and destroy you. The bank robbery was just to get your attention, to take the one thing you had left of your past." He gestured to Clara. "And she is the instrument of your final lesson. My own blood. You will watch me sell my brother's child into a life of misery, and you will know that you are the author of her fate. You will feel what it is to have your future stolen from you." From the other side of the camp, a rifle shot rang out, Abraham starting the diversion. Chaos erupted. Gideon seized the moment, shattering the lock on the captive's chains with a single, well-aimed shot. "Run!" he roared. "To the rocks!" As the captives scattered into the storm, Gideon lunged for Clara, but Silas was faster. He grabbed the girl, holding a knife to her throat. "It ends here, Holt." A figure loomed out of the dust behind Silas. Abraham, his face a grim mask of determination, brought his rifle stock down hard on Silas's arm. The knife clattered to the ground. Silas roared in pain and rage, turning on Abraham. It was the opening Gideon needed. He pushed Clara behind him. "Run to the rocks and don't look back," he commanded. Then he turned to face Silas. The final confrontation had come. In the heart of a raging dust storm, surrounded by chaos and ghosts of the past, Gideon Holt prepared to break the vow he had made 10 years ago. He raised his rifle not for vengeance, but for redemption. The two men circled each other in the red twilight, the debt between them about to be paid in full. The dust storm turned the world into a howling red vortex. Visibility was a few feet at best, the air thick with grit that scoured the skin and choked the lungs. In this swirling chaos, Gideon and Silas faced each other, two figures locked in a decade-old tragedy. Silas, his arm aching from Abraham's blow, lunged at Gideon, his face a mask of pure hatred. Gideon met his charge not with a bullet, but with the solid stock of his Winchester. The impact sent a jarring shock up his arms, but Silas was thrown off balance. They grappled, their fight raw and brutal, a desperate struggle in the blinding dust. Fists flew, grunts of pain, lost to the wind's shriek. Gideon's side screamed in protest, every movement sending a fresh wave of agony through him. but he fought through it, fueled by the image of Clara's terrified face. She believed in you. Silas snarled, landing a solid punch to Gideon's jaw. Her mother filled her head with stories of a noble mountain man. A lie, you are a killer. Holt, you are death. It was an accident. Gideon roared back, shoving Silas away. Your brother was my friend. Liar. Silas charged again, but Gideon was ready. He sidestepped, using Silas's momentum against him, and sent him sprawling into the side of the wagon. From the periphery, flashes of gunfire lit the gloom as Abraham and the newly freed captives fought a desperate battle against Silas's disoriented men. Cries and shouts were whipped away by the wind, creating a surreal symphony of violence. Gideon stood over Silas, his Colt peacemaker now in his hand, the barrel steady on the man's chest. He could end it. One pull of the trigger, and the poison of Silas's vengeance would be purged from the world. His finger tightened. He saw Jacob Croft's face, heard his own son's laughter, felt the phantom weight of the locket in his pocket. And he saw Clara. Killing Silas would not bring back his family. It would not erase the past. It would only make him the monster Silas believed him to be. It would only continue the cycle of violence and blood. He lowered the pistol. No, he said, his voice ragged but firm. It ends. The killing ends with me. Silas stared up at him, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. He saw his chance, his hand darting for the knife he'd dropped. But Gideon was faster. He kicked the blade away and brought the barrel of his pistol down hard on Silas's temple. Silas's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed unconscious. The fight was over. As Gideon stood there, breathing heavily, the wind began to die down, the thick, red curtain of dust starting to thin. The camp was a wreck. Some of Silas's men lay dead or wounded. The rest had fled into the storm. Abraham was helping the last of the captives, his face grim but triumphant. Clara ran from the rocks, her small form a beacon of hope in the settling gloom. She threw her arms around Gideon's legs, her face buried in his trousers. You saved us, she sobbed. You saved everyone. Gideon knelt his wounded side, screaming, and pulled her into a fierce hug. He held her tight, the protector her mother had promised he would be. In the aftermath, the captives gathered their faces, a mixture of exhaustion, grief, and overwhelming gratitude. Abraham, his arm in a makeshift sling, confronted Gideon, his eyes filled with a heavy sorrow. I am sorry, Gideon. My silence. It almost cost you everything. Gideon placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. The anger was long gone, washed away by the blood and dust. You were trying to protect me, Abraham. You acted out of love. There is nothing to forgive. The two men stood in silence for a moment, their friendship reforged in the heart of the storm. As the local sheriff and his posse, alerted by one of the escaped captives, rode into the canyon to take Silas and his remaining men into custody, Gideon made his decision. He looked down at Clara, who still clung to his hand, as if she might never let go. I'll take her, he said to Abraham. I'll raise her as my own. Abraham nodded, a slow smile spreading across his weary face. I think the Lord had that in mind all along. Weeks later, when the first green shoots of spring began to push through the melting snow, Gideon took Clara on a pilgrimage. They rode his mule up to a quiet, sun-dappled clearing high on the mountain, a place marked by two simple wooden crosses. This is where they rest, Gideon said softly. My wife Sarah and my son Thomas. Clara stood beside him, her small hand in his. She didn't speak, her young face solemn with a wisdom beyond her years. She understood loss. Gideon reached into his coat. The sheriff had returned his belongings, including the silver locket. He held it in his palm, and the metal cool against his skin. He clicked it open one last time, gazing at the faces of the family he had lost. For 10 years, this locket had been his anchor to the past, a constant, painful reminder of his grief. But now, holding Clara's hand, he knew he had to let go. The past was a memory, not a home. His home was here now with this child. With a final silent farewell, he placed the locket on the wooden cross that marked Sarah's grave, the silver glinting in the sunlight. He was no longer a prisoner of his sorrow. He was free. As they turned to leave, Clara stopped him. "Wait," she said, her expression serious. "Mama gave me something for you. For the mountain man." She reached into a small pouch she wore and pulled out a folded piece of paper sealed with wax and wrapped in oilcloth. It was a letter, the handwriting elegant but faint. "She made me promise to only give it to you after I was safe." Gideon took it, his hands trembling slightly. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter. To the guardian of the mountain, it began. "If you are reading this, then my daughter is safe, and my faith was not misplaced. My name is Elizabeth Croft. My late husband Jacob spoke of you in the days after he was shot. He did not blame you. He called it a tragedy born of pride and whiskey. He told me you were a good man who had suffered a great loss. I have watched you from afar these many years, a lonely sentinel in the peaks, and I saw the truth of his words. My brother-in-law Silas was twisted by his grief into something cruel. I knew he would one day use my Clara to wound you. My illness left me too weak to fight him, so I did the only thing I could. I sent my daughter to find the one man I knew was strong enough and gentle enough to save her. Thank you, Gideon Holt. Thank you for being the man my husband believed you to be." Tears streamed down Gideon's face, hot and cleansing. He wasn't a killer. He was a protector, a guardian, a father. The guilt he had carried for a decade finally lifted, vanishing into the clear mountain air. He looked at Clara, her blue eyes shining with love and trust. He scooped her into his arms, and she wrapped hers around his neck, her head resting on his shoulder, as if it had always belonged there. The mountain man was no longer alone. He had come down from his peak of sorrow and found his purpose in the heart of a little girl who had never lost faith.